Hey there, road warriors and mystery seekers. Before we dive into what might be the most terrifying story I've ever heard from the highways of America, I need you to do something for me right now. Hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to hear will make you think twice about looking in your rearview mirror ever again, especially if you're driving alone at night through the lonely stretches of Texas highway where reality gets thin and things that shouldn't exist can slip through the cracks. And listen, after you hear what happened to my buddy Dennis Cole when a reflection in his mirror started talking to him, started asking him to switch places, I want you to drop a comment telling me what state or country you're watching from, because I guarantee someone out there has seen something in their mirror that didn't belong there, something that watched them with eyes that weren't quite right. Trust me, folks, you're going to want to stick around until the very end of this one, because what Dennis discovered about the man in his rearview mirror will absolutely shatter your understanding of what separates the living from the dead and make you question whether your reflection is really just light bouncing off glass or something far more sinister. My name is Hank Dawson, and I've been collecting trucker stories for over 30 years now, riding shotgun with some of the most experienced drivers this country has ever produced, hearing tales from every mile of asphalt between the Gulf Coast and the Canadian border. I've heard stories that would make your blood run cold, encounters that challenge everything we think we know about the world, experiences that prove the highways hold more mysteries than any haunted house or cemetery ever could. But nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, prepared me for what Dennis Cole told me one humid August night at a truck stop outside of Houston, Texas. Dennis wasn't the type to believe in ghosts or spirits or anything he couldn't verify with his own senses and his mechanic's understanding of how things worked. 15 years behind the wheel of an 18-wheeler had made him practical, skeptical, and dismissive of superstition or paranormal nonsense that some drivers like to share over coffee and cigarettes during long nights at rest stops. But that night, sitting across from me with hands that wouldn't stop shaking and eyes that kept darting toward mirrors like he expected something terrible to appear in them, I watched a grown man struggle to maintain his sanity while describing an experience that had transformed his understanding of reality and left him terrified of the one tool every driver depends on to stay safe on the road: his rearview mirror. Dennis Cole had been driving the same route for 3 years, hauling freight between Dallas and Houston on Interstate 20, a journey he'd made so many times that his hands could navigate the turns and lane changes almost without conscious thought, while his mind wandered through the mental territory that long-haul drivers inhabited during endless hours of highway hypnosis. The route was approximately 245 miles of mostly straight Texas highway, cutting through landscapes that shifted from urban sprawl to rural farmland to pine forests and back again, familiar territory that Dennis knew as intimately as he knew the layout of his own home. He'd leave Dallas around 8 in the evening, drive through the night when traffic was lighter and temperatures were cooler, and arrive in Houston by early morning to make his delivery before the city's notorious rush hour. Traffic made movement through the metro area a nightmare of stopped vehicles and road rage. The route included one particularly isolated stretch between small towns, a 30-mile section where development was sparse, and the highway cut through darkness, broken only by the occasional farmhouse light or gas station glow. Mile marker 237 sat roughly in the middle of this isolated stretch, marking a spot where the highway curved slightly and a long-abandoned roadside rest area slowly crumbled back into the Texas soil. Dennis always passed this marker around midnight, give or take 15 minutes, depending on traffic conditions in the Dallas metro area and whether he'd stopped for fuel or a quick meal at one of the truck stops that dotted the earlier portions of his route. It was just another marker among hundreds, nothing special or noteworthy, just a number on a post beside the highway that helped drivers track their progress and emergency services locate incidents. 6 months before Dennis told me his story, something had changed at mile marker 237, something subtle at first that he'd dismissed as tired eyes playing tricks on him during the vulnerable hours between midnight and dawn, when human circadian rhythms dipped and perception became unreliable. As he passed the marker that first night, Dennis had glanced at his rearview mirror out of habit, the automatic check that good drivers performed constantly to monitor traffic behind them and stay aware of their surroundings. What he saw made him blink and look again, but by then the moment had passed and the highway behind him showed only the expected emptiness of a rural road at midnight, no other vehicles visible in either direction for miles. But in that brief glance, Dennis could have sworn he'd seen something impossible. A man's face reflected in his mirror, visible as clearly as if someone were sitting in the passenger seat behind him, even though Dennis drove alone and his cab was empty, except for the accumulated detritus of long-haul trucking, food wrappers and empty coffee cups, and the paperwork that tracked his loads and deliveries. The face had been there and then not there, appearing for perhaps 2 seconds before vanishing completely, leaving Dennis questioning whether he'd seen anything at all, or whether exhaustion and the hypnotic effect of endless highway had created a momentary hallucination from random visual noise. He checked his mirrors more carefully for the next few minutes, saw nothing unusual, and decided to dismiss the incident as a trick of light or a sign that he needed to get more sleep during his off hours. The next night, driving the same route at the same time, Dennis approached mile marker 237 with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension, part of him hoping to see the face again to prove it had been real, and part of him hoping it wouldn't appear, because that would mean accepting that something impossible was happening in his truck. As he passed the marker and checked his mirror, there it was again, the man's face, clearer this time, visible for perhaps 3 seconds before fading like morning mist when sunlight hits it. Dennis could see more details now, could make out features that suggested a man in his 30s or 40s, with dark hair and an expression that seemed desperate or pleading, mouth open as if trying to speak words that couldn't cross the barrier between whatever realm he existed in and the solid reality of Dennis's truck cab. Dennis immediately slowed his truck and pulled onto the shoulder, his heart pounding and sweat breaking out on his forehead, despite the air conditioning that kept his cab comfortable against the Texas summer heat. He sat there for several minutes, engine idling, checking all his mirrors repeatedly and seeing nothing but empty highway, stretching in both directions. No other vehicles, no pedestrians, no explanation for what he'd just witnessed. He considered calling someone, reporting what he'd seen, but what would he say? That he was seeing ghosts in his mirror. That would get him pulled off the road for mandatory psychological evaluation, might cost him his job and his livelihood, mark him as unstable in an industry that demanded mental clarity and sound judgment from drivers who controlled vehicles weighing up to 80,000 pounds. He decided to keep the experience to himself, to continue his route and see what developed, to gather more information before jumping to conclusions about what was happening. Dennis pulled back onto the highway and completed his drive to Houston, delivered his load, and spent the day at a motel near the port trying to sleep but mostly staring at the ceiling and replaying those few seconds when the man's face had been visible in his mirror. He considered different explanations, cycling through rational possibilities that would make sense without requiring him to accept supernatural causes. Maybe it was a reflection of something external, light from a passing vehicle or a roadside sign catching his mirror at just the right angle to create an illusion of a human face. Maybe it was a neurological glitch, some misfiring of visual processing centers in his brain that occasionally manifested phantom images. Maybe it was early onset of some degenerative condition that affected perception and required medical attention. But Dennis knew, on a level deeper than rational thought, that what he'd seen wasn't any of those things, that it was real in some way that defied his understanding of how reality worked, that it was going to keep happening, and that he was going to have to decide whether to abandon his route and his job or continue driving through mile marker 237 every night and see where this impossible situation led. He chose to keep driving, partly because he needed the income and couldn't afford to quit without another job lined up, partly because he was curious despite his fear about what was appearing in his mirror, and partly because something about the man's desperate expression made Dennis feel obligated to understand what was happening, like maybe the man needed help that only Dennis could provide if he could figure out what was being asked of him. Over the following weeks, the phenomenon at mile marker 237 became more consistent and more detailed, transforming from an occasional anomaly that Dennis could almost dismiss into an undeniable pattern that demanded acknowledgement and investigation. Every single night as he passed that specific marker around midnight, the man's face would appear in his rearview mirror, visible for progressively longer durations, as if whatever barrier separated his realm from Dennis's was becoming thinner or more permeable with repeated exposure. By the end of the first month, the face would remain visible for up to 10 seconds, long enough for Dennis to study features and try to memorize details that might help him understand who this man was and why he kept appearing at this specific location. The man appeared to be in his late 30s or early 40s, with dark brown hair cut in a style that struck Dennis as slightly out of date, reminiscent of the late 1980s or early 90s, when men wore their hair longer on top and shorter on the sides in ways that looked dated compared to modern styles. His face showed signs of stress or fatigue, with dark circles under eyes that held an expression Dennis initially interpreted as desperation, but gradually came to recognize as something more complex, a mixture of hope and fear and determination, like someone engaged in a difficult task that had to be completed regardless of personal cost. The man's clothing, visible only from the shoulders up in the mirror's reflection, appeared to be a plaid flannel shirt in colors that suggested browns and reds, again styling from a previous decade rather than contemporary fashion. Dennis began documenting the appearances, keeping a detailed log in a notebook he purchased specifically for this purpose, recording the exact time each manifestation occurred, its duration, any variations in the man's appearance or expression, and environmental conditions that might be relevant like weather, traffic density, and Dennis's own physical and mental state. He approached the phenomenon with a systematic method that reflected his mechanical training and practical mindset, treating it as a problem to be analyzed and solved rather than as a supernatural event to be feared or fled from. The log revealed patterns that both comforted and disturbed Dennis. Comforted because patterns suggested rules and predictability rather than random chaos. Disturbed because the patterns confirmed that something real and consistent was occurring, rather than isolated hallucinations he could dismiss. The man always appeared at the same location, never before or after mile marker 237, suggesting that whatever was creating this phenomenon was tied to that specific piece of geography rather than to Dennis personally or to his truck. The appearances always occurred around midnight, within a 15-minute window that Dennis came to anticipate and prepare for, positioning his head and adjusting his mirror angle to maximize his viewing time when the manifestation occurred. The man's expression remained consistent across appearances, that mixture of desperation and determination, but Dennis began noticing subtle variations that suggested the man was aware of him, was trying to communicate something, was perhaps becoming more visible and present with each encounter as some kind of connection strengthened between them. Dennis tried various experiments to understand and interact with the phenomenon, speaking aloud to the mirror when the man appeared, asking questions that received no audible answers, but sometimes seemed to elicit changes in the man's expression that suggested he could hear Dennis, even if he couldn't respond in ways that crossed the barrier between them. Dennis tried photographing the manifestation with his cell phone camera, but the images showed only his normal, empty truck cab, with nothing anomalous visible, suggesting that whatever was appearing in his mirror wasn't reflecting physical light in ways that cameras could capture, or that the phenomenon existed in a wavelength or dimension that human eyes could perceive, but electronic sensors couldn't. He tried video recording his entire pass through mile marker 237 multiple nights, but reviewing the footage showed nothing unusual, just the expected view of an empty highway behind his truck. The failure of technological documentation to capture what Dennis saw repeatedly forced him to question his own sanity and perception, to wonder whether he was experiencing some kind of mental breakdown that manifested as consistent hallucinations tied to a specific location and time. He considered seeking medical or psychological help, but the fear of losing his commercial driver's license and his livelihood kept him silent, kept him driving his route night after night, kept him watching his mirror and documenting appearances that only he could see. He researched psychological conditions that might cause such experiences, learning about Charles Bonnet syndrome, where vision loss could trigger complex visual hallucinations, and various neurological conditions that affected perception, but none of the descriptions quite matched what he was experiencing because his hallucinations were too consistent, too specific, too clearly focused on communicating something rather than being random visual noise generated by a malfunctioning brain. Dennis also began researching the history of mile marker 237, searching online for accident reports, news articles, and any information that might explain why this specific location would be the site of paranormal activity, if that's what he was experiencing. He discovered that the stretch of Interstate 20, where the marker sat, had been constructed in the late 1970s, replacing older highway routes that had served the region since the 1930s and 40s. The abandoned rest area near the marker had operated from 1982 until 1995, when budget cuts had closed many of Texas's smaller rest facilities in favor of concentrating resources at larger, more heavily trafficked locations. Nothing in the official record suggested any reason why this spot would be unusual or significant. No major accidents reported. No deaths or tragedies that would explain a haunting if that's what was occurring. But Dennis persisted in his research, expanding his search to include local newspaper archives and historical society records from the small towns near mile marker 237, looking for anything that might connect to the man in his mirror and explain why this particular stretch of highway had become a place where the boundary between worlds seemed permeable. What he eventually discovered would transform his understanding of the situation completely and reveal that the man in his mirror wasn't just a random ghost or hallucination, but someone with a specific identity and a terrible story that connected directly to Dennis and his nightly route in ways that made the phenomenon both more understandable and infinitely more frightening than anything he'd imagined during his months of mysterious encounters. Dennis's breakthrough came from an unlikely source, an elderly woman named Martha Henderson, who volunteered at the local historical society in one of the small towns near mile marker 237, and who maintained an archive of newspaper clippings about local events going back decades. Dennis had called the historical society on a whim, describing his research interest in the history of Interstate 20 through the region, without mentioning his supernatural experiences, and Martha had invited him to visit their small office, where boxes of yellowed newspaper clippings and faded photographs documented the area's past. He drove there during his daytime hours when he should have been sleeping, his obsession with understanding the mirror manifestation overriding his need for rest and pushing him toward answers, regardless of the personal cost to his health and well-being. Martha was delighted to have a visitor interested in local history, a rare occurrence in the age of internet research, where most people expected information to be instantly available online rather than requiring physical visits to dusty archives maintained by elderly volunteers. She showed Dennis boxes organized by decade, and he started working through the 1980s and 90s, scanning headlines and articles for anything related to Interstate 20 or accidents or incidents that might connect to the man he'd been seeing. Hours passed in the quiet office, broken only by the rustle of old newsprint and Martha's occasional questions about what specifically he was researching. Dennis remained vague, claiming interest in highway safety history and transportation infrastructure development, not wanting to reveal the bizarre truth that drove his investigation. Then he found it, an article from October 1987 about a fatal accident on Interstate 20 near the location that would later become mile marker 237. A truck driver named Raymond Holloway had died when his vehicle left the highway at high speed, crossed the shoulder, and crashed into the wooded area beyond the roadside, killing him instantly despite the structural protection of his cab. The article was brief, typical of highway accident reporting that treated such incidents as routine tragedies rather than significant news events, but it included a photograph of Raymond Holloway taken from his commercial driver's license, and Dennis felt his blood run cold as he recognized the face staring back at him from the 38-year-old newsprint. It was the man from his mirror, unmistakably the same person, despite the photographic quality and the decades that separated the image from Dennis's repeated encounters. Dennis's hands shook as he held the fragile newspaper, his mind racing through implications and possibilities, trying to process the confirmation that the man in his mirror was definitely Raymond Holloway, a trucker who had died at that exact location 38 years ago, whose spirit or consciousness or whatever remained after death had apparently been appearing to Dennis every night for months. Martha noticed Dennis's reaction and moved closer, looking at the article and asking if he knew Raymond or had some connection to the accident. Dennis struggled to formulate a response that wouldn't sound insane, finally admitting that he drove the same route Raymond had been driving when he died, and that he'd become interested in understanding the accident after passing the location so many times during his own nightly trips. Martha's expression grew serious and sad as she shared additional information she remembered about the accident, despite the decades that had passed since it occurred. Raymond Holloway had been a well-known and well-liked driver in the local trucking community, someone who'd driven that route for years without incident, making the crash all the more shocking to people who'd known him. The circumstances of the accident had been strange. Witnesses from other vehicles reporting that Raymond's truck had suddenly swerved across lanes and left the highway without any apparent cause, like blown tire or mechanical failure that would explain the loss of control. The police investigation had concluded that Raymond had likely suffered some kind of medical emergency, like heart attack or stroke, that had incapacitated him while driving, causing the crash. But the violence of the impact had made definitive determination of cause of death impossible. But Martha shared something else, something that hadn't made it into the newspaper article, but had been discussed among locals who'd been curious about the accident. Several people who'd arrived at the crash scene before emergency services had reported something strange. Raymond's body had been found in an unusual position in his cab, as if he'd been struggling against something, his face showing an expression of terror that seemed excessive for someone who'd merely lost consciousness from medical emergency. One witness, a volunteer firefighter who'd helped extract Raymond's body, had told Martha years later that it had looked like Raymond had been fighting something invisible in his cab moments before the crash, that his hands had been raised defensively and his body twisted in ways that suggested he'd been trying to escape from something rather than simply losing control of his vehicle. Dennis felt a chill run down his spine as Martha described these details, a growing certainty forming in his mind that Raymond Holloway's death hadn't been a simple accident caused by medical emergency, but rather something far stranger and more sinister, something that connected to the manifestations Dennis had been experiencing in his mirror every night. He asked Martha if she knew anything else about Raymond, about his life and his roots, and whether anything unusual had happened to him before the fatal accident. Martha recalled that Raymond had been driving the same Dallas to Houston route that Dennis now drove, that he'd been doing it for several years before his death, and that in the weeks before the accident some people had noticed he seemed distracted or troubled, like something was weighing on his mind, but he wouldn't discuss it with others. Dennis spent another hour looking through newspapers from the months before Raymond's death, searching for any additional information or context that might explain what had been happening to the man before he died. He found nothing more in the formal news coverage, but Martha mentioned that there might be other sources of information, people in the local trucking community who'd known Raymond and might remember details that never made it into official records or public reporting. She gave Dennis names and contact information for several retired drivers who'd been active in 1987, suggesting that if Dennis was truly interested in understanding what happened to Raymond Holloway, these men might be willing to share their memories and perspectives with a fellow driver who showed respect for the profession and its history. Dennis contacted 3 of the retired drivers whose names Martha had provided, explaining that he was researching the history of the Dallas-Houston route and had become interested in the Raymond Holloway accident after discovering it occurred on the stretch of highway he now drove nightly. 2 of the men were willing to meet with Dennis and share their memories of Raymond and the circumstances surrounding his death, their willingness apparently motivated by respect for a fellow driver and perhaps by their own curiosity about why someone would be researching an accident that had occurred nearly 4 decades ago. Dennis met with them separately, sitting in truck stop diners and listening to their stories while taking careful notes and trying to piece together a complete picture of what Raymond Holloway had experienced before his fatal crash. The first driver, a man named Carl Peterson, who had driven for the same company as Raymond, confirmed Martha's recollection that Raymond had seemed troubled in the weeks before his death, increasingly withdrawn and reluctant to discuss whatever was bothering him. Carl recalled one conversation about 3 weeks before the accident when Raymond had made a cryptic comment about seeing things in his mirror that shouldn't be there, but had refused to elaborate when Carl pressed for details. At the time, Carl had assumed Raymond was making a joke or referring to unusual traffic situations, but after Raymond's death, that comment had taken on sinister significance, suggesting that Raymond might have been experiencing something strange or disturbing during his drives, but had kept it to himself out of fear of being thought crazy or unstable. Carl also shared that Raymond had been driving the Dallas-Houston route for about 5 years before his death, meaning he would have passed the location that eventually became mile marker 237 hundreds of times during his career. Carl didn't know whether Raymond had ever experienced anything unusual at that specific location before whatever led to his fatal crash, but he remembered Raymond mentioning once that there was a weird stretch on the route where he always felt uncomfortable or watched, though Raymond had attributed that feeling to isolation and darkness rather than to any supernatural cause. Hearing this made Dennis's skin crawl with recognition, knowing that he'd felt exactly the same way about that stretch of highway before the man started appearing in his mirror, that sense of something wrong or off about the area that couldn't be explained by its physical characteristics. The second retired driver, a man named William Chen, who had been friends with Raymond and had driven similar routes through Texas during the 1980s, provided even more disturbing information about Raymond's final weeks. William had been one of the last people to speak with Raymond before the fatal accident, had actually talked to him on the CB radio the night he died, about 2 hours before the crash occurred. William recalled that Raymond had sounded strange during that conversation, distracted and agitated in ways that weren't characteristic of his normally calm and professional demeanor. Raymond had said something that stuck in William's memory across the decades. He'd said, "I think I figured out what it wants from me," but had refused to explain what it was or what he meant, saying only that he had to try something different tonight and that he hoped it would work. William had been driving behind Raymond that night, about 15 miles back on the same route, and had heard the emergency traffic on the CB radio reporting that a truck had crashed near mile marker 237, though the markers weren't numbered exactly the same way back in 1987. William had driven past the accident scene about 30 minutes after it occurred, had seen the emergency vehicles and the wreckage being extracted from the woods, and had known immediately that it was Raymond's truck, even before anyone confirmed it. What haunted William most after all these years wasn't the crash itself, which was tragically common in the trucking industry, but rather Raymond's cryptic final words about what it wants and trying something different, suggesting that Raymond had been engaged in some kind of struggle or negotiation with something during his drives, something that had ultimately killed him. Dennis asked William directly whether he thought Raymond might have been experiencing something paranormal or supernatural during his final weeks, whether the "it" Raymond had mentioned could have been a ghost or spirit or some other entity that appeared during his drives. William was quiet for a long moment before responding, his weathered face showing the conflict between his desire to speak honestly and his reluctance to make claims that would sound insane to skeptical listeners. Finally, he admitted that yes, he'd always suspected that Raymond had been seeing something during his drives, something that had frightened and obsessed him, something he'd been trying to understand or appease or escape from. William had never shared this suspicion publicly because he had no evidence, and because saying such things would invite ridicule or worse, but he'd thought about it often over the years, wondered whether there was something about that particular stretch of highway that affected certain drivers under certain conditions. William then shared something that made Dennis's heart race with a mixture of excitement and terror. He said that Raymond hadn't been the only driver to mention strange experiences on that route, that over the years William had heard whispers from other drivers about seeing things in their mirrors or feeling presences in their cabs while passing through that area, though most dismissed such experiences as fatigue-induced hallucinations or imagination working overtime during the vulnerable midnight hours. William himself had never experienced anything unusual there, had driven that route hundreds of times without incident, but he'd always been slightly uncomfortable passing through that particular stretch, had felt something he couldn't quite define that made him more alert and watchful than usual. Hearing that Raymond's experiences weren't unique, that there was a history of strange phenomena associated with this location, both validated Dennis's experiences and made them more frightening by suggesting that whatever was appearing in his mirror had been there for decades, had interacted with multiple drivers, and had possibly killed at least one of them. Dennis left his meetings with Carl and William feeling both better informed and more disturbed than before, his investigation having confirmed that Raymond Holloway was the man in his mirror and that Raymond had apparently been experiencing similar manifestations before his death. But the information raised as many questions as it answered. Why was Raymond's spirit or consciousness still appearing at that location nearly 4 decades after his death? What had Raymond meant about figuring out what it wants and trying something different? Had Raymond's attempt to deal with whatever was appearing to him caused his fatal crash, or had the crash been the result of refusing to comply with whatever was being demanded? And most urgently, was Dennis heading toward the same fate that had claimed Raymond? Was he engaged in the same dangerous interaction with something that existed beyond normal reality and had the power to kill drivers who either cooperated with it or refused its demands? Armed with the knowledge that the man in his mirror was Raymond Holloway, and that Raymond had apparently been trying to communicate or negotiate with something before his death, Dennis changed his approach to the nightly manifestations at mile marker 237. Instead of simply observing and documenting Raymond's appearances, Dennis began actively trying to communicate with him, speaking directly to the mirror when Raymond appeared, asking questions and making statements designed to elicit responses that might reveal what Raymond wanted or needed. Dennis acknowledged Raymond by name, said, "Hello, Raymond. When the face appeared, identified himself as a fellow trucker driving the same route Raymond had driven and expressed willingness to help if Raymond could somehow indicate what kind of help he needed. For several nights, Dennis's attempts at communication produced no obvious results, Raymond's expression remaining unchanged and no sounds or words crossing the barrier between whatever realm he existed in and Dennis's physical truck cab. But Dennis persisted, driven by the knowledge that Raymond had apparently been experiencing something similar before his death and had made some kind of attempt to resolve the situation, an attempt that had either succeeded or failed in ways that led to his fatal crash. Dennis varied his communication attempts, trying different approaches and asking different questions, sometimes speaking calmly and sometimes with urgency, sometimes during the brief window when Raymond was visible, and sometimes before or after in case Raymond could hear, even when he wasn't visible to Dennis's eyes. Then, about 3 weeks after Dennis had learned Raymond's identity, something changed during one of the nightly manifestations. Dennis was passing mile marker 237 at his usual midnight hour, watching his mirror and beginning his standard communication attempt, when Raymond's face appeared and for the first time showed clear awareness of Dennis's words. Raymond's mouth moved as if trying to speak, his expression shifting from its usual desperate determination to something more focused and intent, and although no sound emerged that Dennis could hear, the deliberate nature of Raymond's attempt to communicate was unmistakable. Dennis felt a surge of excitement mixed with fear, the confirmation that two-way communication might be possible, opening up possibilities that were both hopeful and terrifying. Dennis immediately pulled onto the shoulder after passing the marker, his hands shaking with adrenaline and his mind racing with implications. He sat there for several minutes, talking to his empty truck cab and hoping that Raymond could somehow still hear him, even though the manifestation had faded, as it always did, once Dennis moved beyond that specific location. Dennis explained who he was, how he'd learned Raymond's identity, what he'd discovered about Raymond's death, and his willingness to help if Raymond could find a way to communicate what he needed. Dennis promised to return the next night and every night after that, to keep trying until they found a way to bridge the communication gap between them, to understand what Raymond had been experiencing and what had ultimately killed him. The next night, Dennis approached mile marker 237 with intense anticipation, uncertain what to expect, but hoping that his previous night's response to Raymond's communication attempt had been noticed and would lead to further progress. As Raymond's face appeared in the mirror, Dennis saw immediately that something was different. Raymond looked more solid somehow, more present, as if the boundary between his existence and Dennis's was becoming more permeable, or as if Raymond was learning to project himself more strongly across that boundary. Raymond's mouth moved again, forming words that Dennis still couldn't hear, but could begin to read from the shape and movement of his lips. Dennis stared intensely at the mirror, trying to interpret what Raymond was saying, and after several attempts managed to recognize one repeated phrase, "He wants," or possibly "it wants," confirming William Chen's recollection of Raymond's final words about what it wants. Dennis's excitement at achieving some level of communication was tempered by confusion about what Raymond meant by "he wants" or "it wants," and who or what the pronoun was referring to. Dennis called out questions, asking Raymond to clarify, to provide more information, to explain who was making demands or what was being requested. Raymond's expression showed frustration, the difficulty of communication across whatever barrier separated them clearly taking toll on his ability to maintain presence in Dennis's mirror. Raymond's mouth moved through several attempts to convey additional information, and Dennis thought he could make out the words "switch," or "change," or possibly "trade," but the meaning remained unclear, and Raymond faded before Dennis could gain better understanding of what was being communicated. Over the following week, Dennis and Raymond developed a rudimentary form of communication through repeated attempts and gradual refinement of technique. Raymond learned to mouth words more clearly and deliberately, making it easier for Dennis to lip-read even without audio. Dennis learned to ask yes or no questions that Raymond could answer through nodding or shaking his head, though the movements were subtle and easily missed if Dennis wasn't watching carefully. Through this painstaking process, Dennis began piecing together information that was both enlightening and deeply disturbing about what Raymond had experienced and what was apparently now happening to Dennis as he drove the same route and passed the same location where Raymond had died. Raymond confirmed through nods and headshakes that he'd been seeing something in his mirror during his final weeks of life, that whatever he'd seen had been making demands or requests of him, and that his fatal crash had been connected to his response to those demands, though the exact nature of the connection remained unclear through their limited communication method. Raymond made it clear through repeated attempts that something wanted to switch places or trade with him, concepts that Dennis found confusing and frightening without fuller context about what such an exchange would mean or entail. Most disturbing was Raymond's confirmation that the same entity or presence that had appeared to him was now appearing to Dennis, that Dennis was experiencing the beginning of the same process that had led to Raymond's death, and that Dennis was in danger of suffering the same fate unless he could either comply with whatever was being demanded or find some way to escape the situation that Raymond had apparently failed to discover. As Dennis continued his nightly communications with Raymond Holloway through the limited medium of lip-reading and gestures, the manifestations began changing in ways that suggested escalation of whatever process was unfolding. Raymond appeared earlier in Dennis's approach to mile marker 237, becoming visible when Dennis was still half a mile away from the marker, instead of appearing only at the precise moment of passing it. Raymond also remained visible for longer durations, sometimes staying in the mirror for up to 30 seconds after Dennis had passed the marker, giving them more time to attempt communication, but also creating a situation where Dennis was distracted from his driving by intense focus on his mirror while his truck rolled down the highway at 65 miles per hour, carrying tens of thousands of pounds of cargo and kinetic energy. Dennis also started noticing changes in his own experiences during and after the nightly manifestations. Subtle at first, but becoming more pronounced as weeks passed. He felt increasingly drained and exhausted after each encounter with Raymond, as if the communication process was somehow consuming his energy or vitality in ways that went beyond normal tiredness from maintaining concentration during difficult tasks. His sleep became disturbed by vivid dreams, where he saw himself from outside perspectives, as if he were observing his own life through someone else's eyes, experiencing his own existence as a spectator rather than as the person living it. He began having moments of dissociation during his waking hours, brief flickers where he felt disconnected from his body and unsure whether he was really Dennis Cole or someone else wearing Dennis Cole's life like an ill-fitting suit. The dreams became more specific and more disturbing, showing Dennis images and experiences that he recognized as not his own, memories that belonged to Raymond Holloway from the years before his death. Dennis dreamed of driving the same route he drove every night, but seeing it through eyes that weren't his, from a slightly different height and angle, because Raymond had been a taller man than Dennis, feeling emotions and thoughts that belonged to someone else's consciousness. In these dreams, Dennis experienced Raymond's growing awareness that something was appearing in his mirror. Raymond's attempts to understand and communicate with the manifestation, Raymond's gradual realization that the entity wanted something from him that he found terrifying to contemplate, and finally Raymond's desperate decision to try something different on the night that would prove to be his last. Dennis woke from these dreams feeling violated and frightened, understanding that what he was experiencing went far beyond simple ghostly appearances or paranormal phenomena and represented something more invasive and dangerous, some kind of merging or bleeding of consciousness between himself and Raymond, as if the boundary between Dennis's mind and Raymond's memories was becoming permeable in the same way that the boundary between living and dead seemed permeable at mile marker 237. Dennis began to fear that the switch places or trade that Raymond had mentioned through their limited communication referred not just to some abstract spiritual exchange, but to something far more literal and horrifying. An actual exchange of consciousness, where Raymond would somehow take over Dennis's living body, while Dennis's consciousness would be displaced into whatever liminal realm Raymond currently inhabited. Then one night, approaching mile marker 237 with his usual mixture of dread and compulsion, Dennis saw something that made his blood run cold and confirmed his worst fears about what was happening. As Raymond's face appeared in the mirror, Dennis realized with shock that Raymond wasn't just appearing as a reflection anymore. He was sitting in the passenger seat behind Dennis, visible not just in the mirror, but in Dennis's peripheral vision as an actual physical presence in the truck cab. Dennis whipped his head around to look directly at the passenger seat, but it appeared empty when he looked at it straight on. Only in his mirror and in his peripheral vision could Dennis see Raymond sitting there, becoming more solid and more present with each passing second, his expression showing intense concentration as if he were putting tremendous effort into manifesting more fully in Dennis's reality. Dennis's heart hammered in his chest as he tried to divide his attention between watching the road ahead, monitoring Raymond's increasing solidity in his mirror, and fighting the panic that threatened to overwhelm his ability to think and react appropriately. Raymond's lips moved, forming words that Dennis could now almost hear as faint whispers that seemed to come from inside his own head rather than from any external source. "Switch places," Raymond whispered, his voice carrying tones of desperation and pleading. "Let me live again. Let me finish my life. Let me have another chance. Please, Dennis, switch places with me." The directness of the request, the confirmation that what Raymond wanted was exactly what Dennis had feared, sent waves of terror through Dennis's body and mind. Dennis immediately understood the full horror of his situation. Raymond Holloway had been dead for 38 years. But his consciousness or soul or whatever essential part of him that made him who he was had remained trapped in some liminal space connected to the location where he died, unable to move on to whatever existence awaited beyond death, unable to rest or find peace, condemned to remain in a state between life and death while watching the living world continue without him. Raymond wanted to escape that prison by taking over Dennis's living body, by somehow displacing Dennis's consciousness and inserting his own into the flesh and life that Dennis currently inhabited. And whatever entity or force governed the liminal space where Raymond was trapped apparently facilitated such exchanges, allowed them under certain conditions, had possibly orchestrated Raymond's current situation as a trap or a test, or simply as the mechanism through which it operated in its interactions with the living world. Dennis realized with mounting horror that he was facing an impossible choice. Either refuse Raymond's request and risk suffering the same fate that had claimed Raymond 38 years ago, ending up trapped in the liminal space while Raymond or some other consciousness took over his body, or agree to the exchange and voluntarily surrender his life and identity to give Raymond another chance at living, effectively committing a form of existence-ending self-sacrifice that would leave Dennis in whatever hellish state Raymond currently endured. Both options were unacceptable, both represented forms of death or worse than death, and Dennis's mind raced desperately for some third alternative, some way to escape the trap he'd driven into through simple bad luck of being assigned the same route that Raymond had driven decades before. Dennis stopped driving his regular route, calling in sick and using accumulated vacation time to avoid having to pass mile marker 237 while he desperately researched ways to escape or resolve his situation. His absence from the route was temporary at best, because his job required him to drive that specific corridor, and he couldn't avoid it indefinitely without losing his employment and his livelihood. But he needed time to think and investigate, without the nightly pressure of encountering Raymond and being asked repeatedly to surrender his existence. Dennis spent his days scouring the internet for information about possession, consciousness transfer, body swapping, and any occult or paranormal phenomena that might relate to what he was experiencing. He read accounts from around the world of similar situations where the dead sought to reclaim life by displacing the living, where certain locations or conditions created opportunities for such exchanges, where individuals had either escaped such fates or failed to do so and vanished into the liminal spaces between life and death. Dennis also contacted paranormal researchers and investigators, people who studied such phenomena professionally or semi-professionally, academics who took supernatural experiences seriously even when mainstream science dismissed them as delusions or misperceptions. He described his situation in careful detail through emails and phone calls, shared the documentation he'd accumulated, explained about Raymond Holloway and the accident from 1987, and the communications that had been developing over months of nightly encounters. The responses varied from skepticism to fascination to alarm, but several researchers took Dennis seriously and offered advice or information that might help him navigate his dangerous situation. One researcher, a professor of folklore and mythology at a Texas university who studied what she called liminal hauntings, explained to Dennis that locations where violent or sudden deaths occurred sometimes became thin places where the boundary between living and dead grew permeable, where spirits or consciousness fragments could become trapped in the moment of their death and remain there indefinitely unless freed through specific interventions or unless they found ways to escape on their own. She said that Dennis's situation matched patterns she'd documented in other cases, where trapped entities would attempt to exchange places with living people who regularly passed through the thin place, creating an opportunity for the dead to return to life while condemning the living to the trap the dead had escaped. She warned Dennis that such exchanges were extremely dangerous and rarely ended well even when attempted voluntarily, that the consciousness structures of the living and dead were fundamentally incompatible, and that forcing them to switch places usually resulted in both parties being damaged or destroyed in the process. The professor shared information about documented cases where such exchanges had been attempted, outcomes that ranged from complete failure, where nothing happened except the death or madness of the living person who'd agreed to try, to partial success, where the dead consciousness successfully entered the living body but found it unable to maintain the occupation and faded away after days or weeks, while the original living consciousness never fully returned, leaving the body in vegetative state or with severely damaged personality, to rare cases where the exchange seemed to work at least temporarily, though the long-term fates of those involved were often unknown or disturbing. No case she documented showed a clean, successful exchange where the dead person simply took over the living person's life and continued on happily while the displaced living consciousness peacefully transitioned to whatever lay beyond death. Every attempt at such exchanges created tragedy and suffering for everyone involved, suggesting that whatever force enabled such possibilities was either malevolent or completely indifferent to human welfare. The professor's advice was clear and unequivocal. Dennis should not, under any circumstances, agree to switch places with Raymond Holloway, should not attempt any rituals or practices designed to facilitate such an exchange, should avoid mile marker 237 completely if possible, and if not possible, should pass through it as quickly as possible without engaging in any communication with Raymond or any other entities that might appear there. She said his best hope for survival and safety was to break the pattern of nightly encounters that had been strengthening the connection between himself and Raymond, to stay away from the thin place until the connection weakened and faded, to essentially starve the phenomenon of the repeated interaction that fed it and made it progressively more powerful. She acknowledged that this advice might cost Dennis his job, but insisted that his job wasn't worth his soul or consciousness or whatever essential part of him that made him who he was. Dennis also consulted with a medium who claimed ability to communicate with the dead and understand spiritual matters beyond normal perception. The medium performed what she called a reading on Dennis, attempting to sense what attachments or connections he'd accumulated through his interactions with Raymond. She reported with obvious concern that Dennis was deeply entangled with Raymond's consciousness, that their repeated communications had created pathways between their minds that Raymond was actively using to prepare for the attempted exchange, that Dennis was already partially inhabited by fragments of Raymond's memories and personality as a kind of reconnaissance mission where Raymond was mapping Dennis's consciousness to determine how to most effectively displace it. The medium warned that if Dennis continued his current pattern of nightly encounters and communication attempts, the exchange would eventually happen whether Dennis consented or not, that Raymond was growing progressively stronger while Dennis was growing progressively weaker, that the balance between them was shifting in ways that would eventually tip past the point where Dennis could resist or refuse. The medium offered to perform cleansing rituals designed to sever or weaken the connections between Dennis and Raymond, to clear Dennis's consciousness of the fragments that Raymond had inserted, to provide spiritual protection that might make Dennis more resistant to Raymond's attempts at displacement. Dennis agreed and underwent a series of sessions where the medium performed elaborate rituals involving sage smoke and sacred salts and prayers in languages Dennis didn't recognize, rituals that left him feeling lighter and clearer afterward, but which the medium admitted provided only temporary respite rather than permanent solution to his problem. The medium explained that the source of the danger was the thin place itself at mile marker 237, that as long as Dennis continued passing through that location, he would remain vulnerable to Raymond and to whatever entity or force governed that liminal space. That permanent safety required either avoiding the location completely or finding some way to close the thin place and free Raymond from his trap without surrendering Dennis's own existence in the process. After 2 weeks of absence from his route, Dennis could no longer delay returning to work without losing his job entirely. His employer had been understanding about his sick leave, but made clear that his position required reliable service, and that if he couldn't drive his assigned route, he would need to accept reassignment to different routes that might pay less or have less favorable schedules, or simply be let go to make room for drivers who could meet the company's needs. Dennis tried requesting reassignment to different corridors, but was told his seniority didn't provide sufficient leverage to make such demands, and that he either needed to return to his Dallas-Houston route or face termination. Facing financial realities and the knowledge that he couldn't hide from his problem indefinitely, Dennis made the decision to return to his regular route, but to approach the situation differently, armed with the knowledge and advice he'd accumulated during his research and consultations. Dennis prepared for what he thought of as a confrontation with Raymond and whatever entity or force governed mile marker 237. He carried protective talismans the medium had provided, wore a small pouch of blessed salt around his neck, rehearsed prayers and phrases that were supposedly effective at repelling spiritual intrusions, steeled his mind and will against Raymond's pleas and pressure to agree to switch places. Most importantly, Dennis had decided that instead of avoiding communication or trying to help Raymond escape his trap, he would attempt to understand what had actually happened during Raymond's fatal accident and why Raymond had remained trapped for 38 years instead of moving on to whatever existence lay beyond death. Dennis hoped that understanding might reveal some way to free Raymond without sacrificing himself, some third option beyond the binary choice of switch places or remain trapped. Dennis's first night back on the route was intensely stressful, his entire body tense with anticipation and fear as he approached mile marker 237 around midnight. As expected, Raymond appeared in his mirror, but his expression had changed during Dennis's absence. Instead of the desperate determination Dennis had become accustomed to, Raymond looked angry and betrayed, his face contorted with rage that made him appear threatening rather than pitiable. Raymond manifested more solidly than he had before Dennis's absence, sitting in the passenger seat behind Dennis and visible not just in mirrors, but in Dennis's direct vision when he glanced to the side, his form more substantial and his presence more oppressive, filling the truck cab with a coldness that had nothing to do with air temperature and everything to do with the proximity of something that existed between life and death. "You ran away from me." Raymond's voice came through clearly now, no longer whispered, but spoken aloud in tones that Dennis could hear with his physical ears rather than sensing internally. "You abandoned me after making me believe you would help. You left me here alone for 2 more weeks in this hell where I've been trapped for 38 years. Do you have any idea what it's like, Dennis? Do you understand what it means to be conscious and aware but unable to truly exist? To watch the world move forward without you? To see other people living the life you should have had? I had a wife, Dennis. I had children. I had a future that was stolen from me on this highway, and you're the first person in decades who could help me get it back, and you ran away." The anger and pain in Raymond's voice was palpable, making Dennis feel guilty, despite knowing that agreeing to Raymond's request would mean his own destruction. Dennis forced himself to respond calmly despite his fear, keeping his eyes on the road while also watching Raymond in his peripheral vision. "I didn't run away, Raymond. I took time to understand what's happening here, to research and learn about your situation, so I could help you properly, instead of just blindly agreeing to something that would destroy us both. I know you're suffering, I understand you want to escape, but what you're asking me to do, switching places with you, that's not going to work the way you think it will. The researchers I consulted said that consciousness exchanges almost never succeed, that they destroy both parties involved, that even if you managed to take over my body, you wouldn't be able to maintain it, and I'd be stuck wherever you are now while my body fails and dies with neither of us in control." Dennis hoped that reasoning with Raymond might work better than simple refusal, might appeal to whatever part of the man remained rational after decades of desperate isolation. Raymond's expression shifted from anger to something more complex, showing layers of desperation and hope and terrible sadness. "They're wrong, Dennis, or they're lying to you to prevent you from helping me. I know the exchange will work because I've seen it work before. Because I'm not the first one trapped here, and I won't be the last. The man who was here before me, the one who occupied this space before I took his place, he made the exchange successfully, and I watched him drive away in someone else's body while I remained behind to become the new resident of this liminal hell. That's how it works, Dennis. Someone has to be here, trapped in this moment, serving as the anchor for the thin place. The entity that governs this location requires a consciousness to maintain the boundary between life and death, and exchanges are the only way for the trapped consciousness to escape. If I don't take your place, I'll be here forever, or at least until another driver comes along who's willing to help me, which might be never, since you're the first person who's been able to see me clearly in all these years." The revelation that Raymond had displaced someone else, that this was an ongoing cycle of replacement and entrapment rather than a unique situation, made Dennis's blood run cold with new understanding of the horror he'd stumbled into. Dennis's mind raced through implications of what Raymond had just revealed, pieces of the puzzle falling into place in ways that made the situation even more nightmarish than he'd imagined. "Who was here before you, Raymond? Who did you displace when you ended up trapped here? Was that what caused your accident, attempting to switch places with whoever was trapped here before you?" Dennis asked, needing to understand the full scope of what he was dealing with. Raymond's expression grew more troubled, shame and guilt mixing with the desperation and anger that had dominated his features. His name was Thomas Brennan. He'd been trapped here since the 1950s, when that stretch was still old Highway 80 before they built the interstate. I started seeing him in my mirror during my drives, same as you've been seeing me. He explained what he needed, begged me to help him, told me about the exchange process and how it was the only way he could escape after being trapped for 30 years. I agreed because I felt sorry for him, because I thought I was doing a good deed, because I didn't understand that the exchange would fail and leave me in his place, while he simply ceased to exist entirely instead of taking over my body like he'd promised would happen. The truth crashed over Dennis like a physical force. Raymond's accident hadn't been caused by trying to resist or escape the trapped entity, but rather by agreeing to help and attempting the exchange, an attempt that had killed Raymond and left him trapped, while Thomas Brennan had simply vanished without successfully taking over Raymond's life. The exchanges weren't successful escapes that allowed the trapped to return to life at the expense of the living. They were simply methods by which the thin place acquired new consciousness anchors to replace ones that were consumed or destroyed in failed exchange attempts. The entire setup was a trap designed to perpetuate itself, to lure in willing victims through false promises of successful exchanges that never actually worked as advertised. And now Raymond was attempting to perpetuate the same lie to Dennis that Thomas Brennan had told to Raymond decades before, either because Raymond genuinely believed it would work or because he was desperate enough to doom another person to his fate on the slim chance that this time the exchange might actually succeed. "So Thomas didn't successfully escape by taking your place," Dennis said slowly, understanding crystallizing into terrible clarity. "He just ceased to exist, and you became the new anchor consciousness for this location. Which means if I agree to switch with you, the same thing will happen. I'll die or become trapped here while you simply disappear without gaining anything, and then the cycle continues with whoever I eventually convince to try switching with me. This isn't a rescue operation, Raymond. It's a con game run by whatever entity maintains this thin place, using trapped consciousnesses as bait to attract new victims. We're not going to switch places because that would just perpetuate the cycle and doom us both to destruction. What we need to do is find a way to close this thin place entirely, to free you and prevent anyone else from being trapped here in the future." Dennis said this with more confidence than he felt, having no idea whether closing a thin place was even possible, or how one would go about attempting such a thing if it were. Raymond's expression shifted through several emotions as he processed Dennis's refusal and the reasoning behind it, anger giving way to despair, giving way to a terrible resignation. "You think I haven't tried to escape in other ways? You think I haven't spent 38 years attempting every possible method of breaking free from this trap? The entity that maintains this place is ancient and powerful, far beyond anything human consciousness can comprehend or resist. It feeds on the energy of trapped souls, sustains itself through our suffering and our desperate attempts to escape. The only way out is through exchange, even if that exchange is a lie and a trap. At least attempting the switch gives me a chance, however slim, of ceasing to exist entirely instead of remaining trapped here in eternal awareness and isolation. Death would be preferable to this existence, Dennis. Oblivion would be a mercy. And if the exchange might possibly work, if there's even a tiny chance that I could take your place in the living world, then I have to try, because the alternative is continuing, as I am indefinitely into a future without end." The raw pain in Raymond's voice made Dennis's heart ache with sympathy, even as his survival instincts demanded he resist any attempt at consciousness exchange. As Dennis and Raymond argued about the possibility and morality of attempting an exchange, something changed in the atmosphere of Dennis's truck cab, a shift in pressure or temperature, or some quality that had no name, but which both of them sensed immediately. Raymond's expression transformed from desperate pleading to absolute terror. his face draining of what little color it had possessed and his form beginning to flicker like a faulty projection. "It's coming," Raymond whispered, his voice barely audible. "The entity that maintains this place. It's aware of our conversation, our resistance to the planned exchange. It's not pleased, Dennis. You need to drive faster, get away from mile marker 237 immediately before it fully manifests. Once it appears directly, instead of working through me, there's no escaping it, no refusing its demands. Please, Dennis, drive." The absolute terror in Raymond's voice convinced Dennis more than any argument could have that they were both in immediate and terrible danger. Dennis pressed his accelerator, his truck's engine roaring as it fought to build speed while hauling tens of thousands of pounds of cargo, watching his speedometer climb through 70, 75, 80 miles per hour as he tried to put distance between himself and mile marker 237. But even as his truck's physical location moved further from that specific point, Dennis felt something pursuing them through dimensions that had nothing to do with physical space or distance, something vast and hungry and utterly inhuman focusing its attention on his truck and the two consciousness that occupied or partially occupied it. The temperature in his cab plummeted to levels that made Dennis's breath fog in the air despite the summer heat outside, and frost began forming on his windshield from the inside, spreading in patterns that looked disturbingly organic, like veins or nerve networks or the branching structure of lightning frozen in ice. Then Dennis saw it in his mirrors, not Raymond, but something else. Something that hurt to look at directly because it existed partially outside the visual spectrum humans could normally perceive, its form simultaneously insect-like and serpentine and utterly alien to any biological template Earth had produced through millions of years of evolution. It filled the entire view of his rearview mirror, despite not having clear boundaries or defined edges, its presence more a matter of wrongness and impossibility than of occupying specific space. Dennis felt its attention focused on him like the beam of a malevolent spotlight, felt it examining him and evaluating him and determining how best to use him for its purposes. The entity's consciousness, or whatever passed for thoughts in its alien mind, pressed against Dennis's awareness, and he understood without words being spoken that this being had existed long before humans walked the earth, had sustained itself across millennia by feeding on consciousness and suffering, had created thin places throughout the world where it could trap souls and feed on their desperation and fear and eventual dissolution. "Driver," the entity's voice resonated through Dennis's skull without using sound, bypassing his ears entirely to manifest directly in his nervous system, making his whole body vibrate with its terrible presence. "You have been selected. The exchange will occur. Your resistance is noted and irrelevant. The trapped one requires replacement. You will serve as the new anchor. This is not negotiable. This is not optional. This is the price for using the roads that cross my feeding grounds. Raymond Holloway will attempt to take your place in the living world. He will fail, as all before him have failed. You will take his place in the liminal space. This pattern has repeated for centuries and will continue for centuries more. Resistance causes only additional suffering before inevitable compliance." The entity's pronouncement carried weight beyond mere words, feeling like reality itself was being rewritten to accommodate its will. Dennis felt his control over his own body beginning to slip, felt something pushing at the boundaries of his consciousness, trying to force him out of the position of primary occupant of his own mind and flesh. Raymond was becoming more solid in the passenger seat, while Dennis was becoming more translucent and ghostly, their positions beginning to swap in response to the entity's command and power. Dennis's hands on the steering wheel looked increasingly transparent, while Raymond's form gained opacity and substance, and Dennis understood with terror that the exchange was happening whether he consented or not, that the entity had sufficient power to force the switch despite both participants' resistance, that his research and preparation and protective talismans were utterly inadequate against something of such age and power and alien nature. He was going to lose his body and his life, was going to become trapped in Raymond's place, while Raymond briefly inhabited Dennis's flesh before the exchange failed completely and left the truck driverless and careening down the highway at 80 miles per hour, carrying enough weight and momentum to create a catastrophic accident when it inevitably crashed. But in that moment of absolute despair, Dennis remembered something the medium had told him during their consultations, something about entities that fed on desperation and fear, becoming weaker when confronted with acceptance and peace, about how resistance gave them power while surrender paradoxically provided protection. Dennis stopped fighting, stopped resisting the push against his consciousness, stopped feeding the entity with his terror and desperate struggles. Instead, he accepted what was happening, acknowledged his likely death, or worse than death, made peace with losing everything he'd worked for and everyone he'd loved, let go of his attachment to existence itself, and embraced whatever would come after. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The pressure against his consciousness eased, the forced exchange slowed and stuttered, and Dennis felt himself solidifying again in his own body, while Raymond began fading back toward translucence. The entity's presence in his mirrors fluctuated, showing something that might have been confusion or frustration or simply recalculation as its prey stopped behaving according to the patterns it had established over centuries of feeding. "What are you doing?" it demanded, its voice losing some of its terrible certainty. "You must resist. You must fear. You must cling to your existence. That is the pattern. That is what feeds the exchange. Without your resistance, the transfer cannot complete. Without your fear, I cannot sustain the process. You are breaking the rules. You are supposed to fight." Dennis almost laughed despite his terror, understanding suddenly that the entity's power came not from its own strength, but from the emotional energy of its victims, that it couldn't force exchanges through direct power, but only through manipulation of fear and desperation that caused victims to destroy themselves in their frantic struggles to escape. "I'm not playing your game anymore," Dennis said aloud, his voice steady despite the situation. "I'm not going to fight you or Raymond or this exchange. If I'm supposed to be trapped, then I accept being trapped. If I'm supposed to die, then I accept death. If you're going to take my life and consciousness, then take them with my permission, freely given instead of stolen through fear. I refuse to feed you with my resistance. I refuse to empower you with my desperation. You can have whatever you want from me, but you're not getting the satisfaction of watching me struggle and suffer while you consume me." The act of surrendering completely, while simultaneously refusing to provide the emotional energy the entity fed on, created a paradox that disrupted the established pattern, threw sand in the gears of the mechanism. The entity used to perpetuate its feeding cycle, forced it to confront a situation it had no protocol for handling after centuries of victims who all responded with predictable terror and resistance. The entity's presence in Dennis's mirrors writhed and twisted, its alien form convulsing in ways that suggested distress or perhaps rage at having its feeding pattern disrupted by prey that refused to behave according to established rules. Dennis maintained his state of acceptance and surrender, focusing on peace and letting go rather than on fear and clinging to existence, starving the entity of the emotional energy it required to complete the exchange process. Raymond watched this confrontation with an expression that mixed hope with disbelief, perhaps seeing for the first time in 38 years the possibility of a different outcome than the endless cycle of failed exchanges and new trapped consciousnesses, replacing old ones, in service to an ancient and hungry entity that existed outside normal human understanding. "Raymond," Dennis said quietly, maintaining his internal state of acceptance while engaging with the other consciousness present in his truck. "You don't have to keep serving this thing. You don't have to lure in new victims or participate in exchanges that you know will fail and doom others to your fate. You could choose to refuse, to starve it of prey even if that means remaining trapped forever. You could choose to break the cycle even at the cost of never escaping yourself. That would be the real way to defeat this entity, not through trying to escape individually, but through collective refusal to participate in its feeding mechanism. If every trapped consciousness refused to bait new victims, if everyone accepted their trapped state without the desperate struggle to escape, the entity would eventually starve, and the thin places would close, and no new victims would be taken. Dennis didn't know if what he was saying was true or possible, but he believed it might be, and his belief seemed to have power in this situation where consciousness and will shaped reality as much as physical laws did. Raymond's expression shifted through confusion and consideration, and finally something that might have been resolution or acceptance of a terrible truth. "I've been serving it," Raymond said slowly, horror creeping into his voice as he truly understood his complicity for the first time. "For 38 years, I've been its tool, luring in drivers and attempting exchanges that I knew from my own experience wouldn't work, but tried anyway because my desperation to escape overrode my conscience and my compassion. I've been as much a predator as a victim, Dennis. I've spent decades trying to do to others what was done to me, perpetuating the cycle that keeps this entity fed and powerful. What if we all refused? What if every consciousness that's ever been trapped here had simply accepted their fate without trying to escape through victimizing others? Would the thin places close? Would the entity starve? Have I spent decades in unnecessary suffering because I kept feeding the very thing that imprisoned me? The realization seemed to break something in Raymond, or perhaps fix something that had been broken when he'd first been trapped, restore some aspect of his humanity that had been eroded by decades of desperate survival instincts. The entity in the mirrors convulsed more violently, its presence flickering and fading, like a signal losing strength. "No!" it commanded, but its voice carried less weight now, less certainty and power. The pattern must continue. The cycle must be maintained. Trapped ones must attempt escape. New victims must be taken to replace those who dissolve through failed exchanges. This is how it has always been. This is how it must always be. You cannot change the fundamental rules. You cannot break what has been established across millennia. But even as it insisted on the inevitability of its pattern, Dennis could sense weakness growing in its presence, could feel the thin place beginning to destabilize as both its potential victim and its current trapped consciousness refused to play their assigned roles in the feeding cycle. "I won't try to escape anymore," Raymond said, his voice carrying newfound strength and determination. "I won't lure any more drivers into this trap. I won't participate in any more exchanges. I accept being trapped here for however long it takes until this entity starves and dies and releases everyone it's ever imprisoned." And Dennis is right. If I'd made this choice 38 years ago, instead of trying desperately to escape through victimizing others, maybe the thin place would have closed already and no one else would have been trapped after me. I can't undo the damage I've done or bring back the drivers I tried to exchange with over the decades, but I can stop perpetuating the cycle now. I choose to break the chain, even if that means my consciousness eventually dissolves in this liminal space. That would be a better fate than becoming a predator in service to something as evil as this entity has proven to be. Raymond's acceptance seemed to have even more power than Dennis's had, perhaps because he'd been trapped longer and his consciousness carried more weight in the liminal space's structure. The effect on the entity was catastrophic. Its presence in the mirrors began fragmenting, breaking apart into smaller pieces that dissolved like smoke in wind, its control over the thin place unraveling as the primary mechanism it used to maintain and feed the space. The desperate struggles of trapped consciousnesses and willing victims was removed through conscious refusal by both parties. Dennis felt the temperature in his cab returning to normal, felt the oppressive weight of alien attention lifting from his mind, felt reality reasserting itself in normal patterns as the thin place lost cohesion and began collapsing. The frost on his windshield melted instantly, and Raymond's form began fading, not through moving back into the liminal space, but through genuinely being released from his decades-long imprisonment, his consciousness finally free to move on to whatever existence waited beyond death, now that he'd broken his contract with the entity through choosing acceptance over desperate escape attempts. "Thank you, Dennis," Raymond said, as his form became increasingly transparent, his voice growing fainter but carrying genuine gratitude and relief. "Thank you for showing me the way out that I should have found 38 years ago. Thank you for refusing to become another victim in the cycle. Thank you for helping me remember what it means to be human, instead of just a desperate survival instinct, willing to hurt others to save myself. I can feel the pull now, the real pull toward whatever comes after death, not the false promise of returning to life through stealing someone else's body. I'm finally free, Dennis. And it's because you were brave enough to surrender instead of fighting, wise enough to accept instead of resisting. Tell my story if you can. Warn other drivers about thin places and entities that feed on desperation. Maybe your warning will save someone else from falling into a similar trap. And Dennis, live your life fully and without regret. You've earned a future that I gave away through my own mistakes." Raymond's final words faded into silence as his form disappeared completely, leaving Dennis alone in his truck cab with only ordinary darkness visible in his rearview mirror and the Texas highway stretching ahead toward his destination in Houston. Dennis drove the remaining miles to Houston in a state of shock and exhaustion, his mind struggling to process what had happened and the knowledge that he'd somehow survived an encounter that should have killed him, or worse. He completed his delivery in a daze, checked into a motel, and slept for 16 hours straight without dreaming. His consciousness apparently granted respite after the trauma of confronting an ancient entity and helping to free a trapped soul. When he woke, Dennis immediately drove back to mile marker 237 during daylight hours, wanting to see the location where he'd nearly lost everything and confirm that the thin place had truly closed. What he found was unremarkable highway, with no sense of wrongness or watching presence, just ordinary asphalt and desert landscape that held no more mystery or danger than any other random point along Interstate 20. The thin place was gone, dissolved when its anchoring consciousness had been released and its feeding mechanism had been disrupted beyond repair. Dennis continued driving the Dallas-Houston route for several more months after his encounter with Raymond Holloway and the entity that had imprisoned him, passing mile marker 237 twice daily without ever again experiencing manifestations or sensing any wrongness about the location. The thin place had closed completely, releasing whatever other consciousnesses might have been trapped there besides Raymond and ending the cycle of exchanges and victimization that had persisted for potentially centuries, according to the entity's own claims. Dennis felt profound relief every time he passed that marker without incident, grateful to have escaped a fate that had claimed Raymond and probably countless others before him. Thankful to have had the wisdom or luck or guidance to choose acceptance over resistance at the crucial moment when his response determined whether he survived or joined the ranks of trapped souls feeding an ancient predator. Dennis also felt an obligation to share his story, to warn other drivers about the existence of thin places and entities that fed on desperation and fear, to provide information that might help someone else avoid or survive a similar encounter. He started reaching out to trucking communities online and in person, sharing his experience in forums and at truck stops, writing detailed accounts that he published on paranormal research websites and sent to investigators who studied such phenomena. The responses varied from belief to skepticism to mockery, but Dennis persisted, knowing that even if only a few people took his warning seriously, that might be enough to save someone from Raymond's fate. He emphasized in every telling that the key to surviving such encounters was accepting whatever outcome occurred, instead of fighting desperately to escape, starving the entity of the fear and resistance that fueled its power and feeding mechanisms. Several drivers contacted Dennis privately after reading or hearing his story, sharing their own experiences with thin places and trapped consciousness and entities that existed in the margins between life and death. Some had survived encounters similar to Dennis's through luck or instinct, or their own wisdom in choosing acceptance over resistance. Others had lost friends or colleagues to mysterious accidents at specific highway locations, where patterns of deaths and disappearances suggested something predatory lurking beyond normal perception. Dennis compiled these accounts into a comprehensive document that he shared widely throughout trucking communities and with paranormal researchers, creating a database of dangerous locations that drivers could be aware of and potentially avoid, or at least approach with appropriate caution and mental preparation. The document grew to include dozens of locations across the United States where thin places might exist, marked by patterns of accidents or reports of supernatural encounters or simply feelings of wrongness that multiple independent drivers had reported. Dennis also sought out the paranormal researchers and the medium who had helped him during his crisis, sharing what had happened and confirming that their advice about acceptance and surrender had ultimately saved him from Raymond's fate. The professor of folklore and mythology was fascinated by Dennis's account, saying it was the first documented case she'd encountered where someone had successfully closed a thin place by refusing to participate in its feeding cycle rather than through ritual cleansing or location avoidance. She asked Dennis's permission to write academic papers about the case and use it in her teaching, hoping to develop protocols that might help other people caught in similar situations understand how to respond effectively. Dennis agreed, wanting his terrifying experience to serve some useful purpose beyond merely his own survival, wanting Raymond's final sacrifice and moment of redemption to mean something beyond just freeing one trapped consciousness. The medium who had performed cleansing rituals on Dennis confirmed that he no longer carried any attachments or fragments of Raymond's consciousness, that whatever entanglement had developed between them during months of nightly encounters had been fully resolved when Raymond moved on to his proper afterlife destination. She said that Dennis was extraordinarily lucky to have survived his encounter intact, that most people who became entangled with thin places and feeding entities ended up dead or driven mad or trapped themselves, that his combination of research, preparation, intuition and willingness to surrender at the right moment had created perfect conditions for survival that were difficult to replicate intentionally. She suggested that Dennis had probably been protected by something beyond just his own choices, perhaps by Raymond himself, choosing to help Dennis resist rather than trying to victimize him, or perhaps by other forces that worked against the predatory entities that fed on trapped consciousness and human suffering. Eventually, Dennis left the Dallas-Houston route entirely, accepting reassignment to different corridors, where he wouldn't have to pass through the location that held such traumatic memories, even though the actual danger had been resolved. He drove for several more years before finally retiring from long-haul trucking, using his accumulated savings to open a small business in his hometown where he could stay close to family and friends without spending endless nights alone on dark highways where thin places might lurk. He never forgot Raymond Holloway or the entity that had imprisoned him, or the terror of nearly losing his consciousness and identity to something ancient and hungry and utterly indifferent to human welfare. Dennis carried those memories as both burden and gift. Burden because they had transformed his understanding of reality in ways that made simple existence more frightening. Gift because they had taught him profound truths about the nature of consciousness and will, and the power of acceptance over resistance when confronting forces beyond human control. In his retirement, Dennis occasionally gave presentations at paranormal conferences and trucker gatherings, sharing his story and the lessons he'd learned about surviving encounters with predatory entities that existed in the margins of reality. He always emphasized Raymond's final choice to break the cycle of victimization, to accept eternal imprisonment rather than doom another person to his fate, to prioritize conscience and compassion over desperate self-preservation. Dennis believed that Raymond's redemption was the real story, more important than Dennis's own survival, and that other trapped consciousnesses might be inspired to make similar choices if they heard about Raymond's example. He hoped that somewhere in other thin places scattered across highways and back roads, trapped souls might hear his tale and choose to starve their captors rather than perpetuate cycles of suffering, that Raymond's sacrifice might inspire a cascade of similar decisions that would eventually eliminate all such predatory feeding mechanisms and free every consciousness still imprisoned by entities that fed on desperation and fear. And sometimes, during quiet moments in his retirement, when Dennis sat watching sunsets or spending time with grandchildren or simply existing peacefully in his earned safety, he thought he could feel Raymond's presence briefly, not as a manifestation or haunting, but as a gentle acknowledgement across whatever distance separated the living from the properly dead, a wordless communication that Raymond was at peace and grateful, and watching over the man who had helped him find redemption after decade. Use of being both victim and victimizer. Dennis would raise his hand in salute to those moments, honoring the memory of a man he'd never met in life, but had known more intimately than most living friends through their desperate struggle against something that sought to consume them both. And Dennis would remember the most important lesson from his encounter, that sometimes the only way to win against impossible odds was to stop fighting, to accept whatever came with grace and peace, to surrender completely while refusing to feed the predatory mechanisms that derived power from resistance and fear, to break cycles through conscious choice rather than perpetuate them through desperate survival instincts that created new victims while trying to save oneself.